Buenas noches. Good evening. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your presence tonight and for joining this panel as we reflect on Hispanic Catholicism in the United States, its present contributions and future possibilities. I want to also thank the committee that has made this possible, as well as the different organizations within the university, students, faculty, and administrators. And to those people, to those of you who heard about this event and accepted the invitation, so thank you for being here. And also, for me, it's an honor to share this panel, the table, with these excellent colleagues and friends, colegas y amigos, Nancy, Roberto, and Ken. I will divide my remarks tonight in 3 moments. First, I will do my best to situate the reflection about Hispanic Catholicism, or the Hispanic Catholic experience, in the larger context of U.S. Catholicism in this nation. Second, I will share some details about the first National Symposium on the Present and Future of Catholic Hispanic Ministry in the United States, which was organized and hosted here by our university this past June. And finally, I will make a few remarks about the role of Catholic universities, like Boston College, and the people who constitute them, students, professors, and administrators, as we look forward to the future of Catholicism in this country and the role of Hispanic Catholics in shaping that future. Let us begin with the first section of this presentation. American Catholicism and Latinos, Latinas. The observation that U.S. Catholicism is undergoing significant transitions is not new to most of us. We may be more aware about some of these transitions rather than others, but we all know that something is changing. Let us just walk around the city of Boston, visit the Catholic cities the Catholic churches in the city, and speak to the people who worship in those communities. We know that something is changing, that something is happening. There are at least 3 major transitions that are reshaping the present experience of U.S. Catholicism and will have a significant impact in its future. The first transition, I want to call it cultural. U.S. Catholicism is rapidly transitioning from a Euro-American cultural experience to one that is largely Hispanic and multicultural. Only 5 decades ago, the vast majority of Catholics in the country shared a mostly Euro-American background. Today, the U.S. Catholic landscape looks quite different. Approximately 2.7 U.S. Catholics are Asian and Pacific. 3.7% are African American. And the fastest growing group is that of Hispanic Catholics, constituting about 40%, perhaps more, of the total Catholic population. In about 15 years, half of all U.S. Catholics will be Hispanic. This cultural transition brings challenges that demand well-planned responses rather than adopting defensive attitudes that look with nostalgia to the idea of a glorious past or simply seek to maintain the status quo, whichever that status quo is. The second transition is in terms of leadership. According to a study released last month by CARA, Center of Applied Research in the Apostolate, 91% of Catholic nuns and 75% of priests are 60 or older, and most of their peers are at least 50 years old. Other surveys and studies also reveal that most lay ecclesial ministers in the United States, without including nuns, are beyond their 50s, and many around the age of 60. This is a very clear sign of an aging leadership body, the vast majority of them of Euro-American descent. However, the new generations of priests and lay ecclesial ministers serving in our Catholic communities, both are native-born and immigrants, are more diverse in terms of their cultural backgrounds and much younger. hence the transition. And there is a third transition that I want to notice, and it's a sociological transition. By the middle of the 20th century, millions of American Catholics began to move beyond their traditional neighborhoods and joined mainstream society. Access to higher education, a more professional workforce, and deep changes in the life of the Church coincided in shaping a new phase of Catholicism in the United States. Catholics became a stronger voice in society. Their schools rose up to top levels of recognition, and their political presence significantly increased. Many Catholic families transitioned to the middle class. This is true in many ways, particularly of Euro-American Catholics. However, not all Catholics made it in terms of education, or professional achievement, or economic advancement. Millions of Catholics in this country did not experience the benefits of becoming middle class because of their race, or social location, or cultural background, and in some cases, all three together. To this, we must add that during the last few decades, most of the growth of Catholicism has been concentrated not in the suburbs or the wealthy neighborhoods, but in the large cities and the barrios. Immigration has certainly played an important role in such growth. Most Catholic immigrants, the majority of them from Latin America, are not middle class and lack the socioeconomic stability of many of their mainstream Euro-American Catholic sisters and brothers. Because this last group constitutes the fastest growing sector among Catholics in the country, we are witnessing a social transition back to the barrio and the city that is deeply reshaping the identity of the Catholic experience in this country. At the heart of these transitions, then, are Hispanic Catholics. We are already a numerical majority in the Church, and I repeat, 40%, perhaps more. Of course, the numbers are more evident in some parts of the country, like the Southwest, than in other parts of the country, like New England. Nonetheless, Hispanics are present literally in every diocese of the United States. Hispanic Catholics then stand before the Church and invite our Catholic faith communities, institutions and organizations, Catholic universities and schools to ask the hard questions. How are we responding to the Hispanic presence? In what ways is Hispanic Catholicism transforming the U.S. Catholic experience? Whose responsibility is it to serve Hispanic Catholics? What does it mean to evangelize in the Church in the United States when Hispanic Catholics are becoming the majority? What can the Church do in the United States to address the educational challenges that Hispanic Catholics face? What issues of social justice are more urgent in the Hispanic community? What role will Hispanics play in the future of Catholicism in the United States? These are some of the questions that this past June brought together 63 leaders, Hispanic and non-Hispanic, from all over the country to Boston College for 3 days. These women and men are considered the movers and shakers in the present reflection about Hispanic Catholicism. We gathered bishops, theologians, scholars in various fields, priests, vowed women and men, lay leaders, university administrators, heads of major church organizations, publishers, and practitioners. 3 other institutions of higher education joined in partnership to make this event possible. Barry University in Miami, Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and the Congar Institute for Ministry Development in San Antonio. I was privileged to serve as the convener of such effort. So let us move to what happened in this symposium, which is the second section of my presentation. The leaders gathered at the symposium reflected on the situation that I just described and worked hard to envision what should be the next steps in the reflection about U.S. Catholicism and U.S. Hispanic Catholics. We worked most of the time in 7 small discussion groups, guided by 7 study documents, written in advance by experts in the field. Each participant was assigned to a group according to his or her own expertise. We studied 7 areas: Hispanic ministry in American Catholicism, Hispanic ministry in theology, Hispanic ministry evangelization and religious education, Hispanic ministry liturgy and spirituality, Hispanic ministry and social justice, Hispanic youth and young adult ministry, and Hispanic ministry and leadership formation. Now, any conversation about the present and future of U.S. Catholicism can elicit all kinds of excitement, but at the same time, all kinds of anxiety. Much so if the conversation is around questions of leadership, or full participation in the life of the church, or cultural identity, or language, or allocation of resources and spirituality, to mention only a few, formulated from the Hispanic experience. When such conversation happens in a context that thrives in the open flow of ideas that characterizes the university life, the results are very encouraging. Nothing more enriching than joining an informed conversation where scholars and practitioners listen to data, analysis, and experiences in a respectful manner. The symposium provided such opportunity. We listened to a bishop express sincere concern for his diocesan community undergoing transformations that he and other brother bishops are still trying to understand. We also listened to a youth minister who prophetically reminded national leaders that if we fail to engage our Hispanic youth, we risk losing a whole generation of U.S. Catholics in this country. A priest inquired about how he can better accompany Hispanics in his community while remaining attentive to all the cultural traditions in his community. Or a theologian exploring practical ways to better serve the people in the pews with her scholarship. The symposium was a forum not only to voice current challenges, but also to envision a future where Hispanics will have a significant leading role. Now, 4 major themes surfaced in nearly every conversation during the symposium. And I believe that as we reflect on Latinos, Latinas, and our contributions and future possibilities in shaping the U.S. Catholic experience in this century, these themes must be present in every agenda of reflection. The first theme: Hispanic Catholics must embrace our papel protagonista, our leading role in the process of shaping the next phase of U.S. Catholicism. For this, we must educate more Latinos, Latinas to assume leadership roles in the church and society. We must open ourselves to new models of ministry and theological reflection. And we must assign adequate resources for these protagonistas, leading agents, to continue to build the church in this country. Second, it is imperative that we know and affirm the contributions of Hispanic Catholics to the U.S. Catholic experience. On the one hand, Hispanic Catholics need to have the spaces to share the experience and reflect about it. On the other hand, then, our ecclesial, academic, and societal structures must remain open to be shaped in new ways by the richness of the cultural, intellectual, and spiritual experience of Hispanic Catholics in this country. Third major issue: the overall U.S. Hispanic experience is deeply marked by social and political challenges that must be addressed by all members of the church, not only Hispanics. For instance, poverty, low levels of education, racism, undocumented immigration, poor working conditions, inadequate participation in the decision-making structures of the church, indifference, etc. Unless Catholics in the United States recognize that the issues of injustice affecting Hispanic Catholics, both in society and in the church, are the issues of the whole Catholic community, then the church in the United States will be a divided body. And finally, the fourth major issue is more than 50% of Catholics under the age of 18 in the United States are Hispanic. More than 50% of Catholics under the age of 18. In less than 2 decades, the vast majority of young and young adult Catholics will be of Hispanic descent. All evangelizing efforts by the church, as well as the service, as well as the institutions that are at the service of the formation of Latinos, Latinas, inspired by the values of the Catholic tradition, for instance, universities, must make a preferential option for Hispanic youth. To ignore Hispanic young people in the United States is to risk ignoring the present and the future of Catholicism in this country. So let us look at the future then. The present and future of U.S. Catholicism hablan español. The present and the future of U.S. Catholicism in this country, speak Spanish. Perhaps not literally, but we cannot afford the luxury of ignoring or underestimating the Hispanic Catholic presence. Any agenda of reflection about the future of U.S. Catholicism must take into consideration all 4 points just mentioned. The empowerment of Hispanic Catholic leaders to assume leading roles in the church and society. The affirmation of the many contributions that Hispanics bring to the Catholic Church. The commitment to embracing the major challenges that affect Hispanic Catholics as our own challenges. And finally, the preferential option for Hispanic youth. In the 21st century, our Catholic universities, colleges, seminaries must turn their attention to the signs of the times that shape the lives of U.S. Catholics here and now. The truth is that we do not have an option. I am convinced that Catholic universities are uniquely positioned to lead the way in these commitments. Boston College, through its newly created School of Theology and Ministry, operates perhaps the most successful graduate program in Hispanic ministry in the whole country. The university also continues to increase the number of Hispanic Catholic theologians in its faculty. In this sense, BC has been prophetic, and the eyes of Hispanic Catholic leaders are on us as a model for other institutions. However, graduate studies in Hispanic ministry and Latino-Latina theology are just one way of expressing such commitment. Many of you, and many of the young undergraduate Latinos, Latinas, and graduate Latino, Latinas in this university will advance professional careers in other fields. Thus, Catholic universities have the moral obligation to contribute to strengthening the church in this country by preparing Hispanic professionals in the best possible way. Tonight, Nancy, Roberto, and I speak as Hispanic Catholic theologians. Our work is profoundly informed by the wisdom and treasures of the Christian tradition, and intentionally shaped by the socio-historical and cultural circumstances in which Latinos, Latinas live in the United States. How we advance our scholarship, how we theologize, the way we teach, and how we serve reflects our experience as Latinos, Latinas living in this country. An experience that is rooted en la realidad de nuestro pueblo, in the reality of our people. This is our contribution. Now, I invite you to consider accepting the challenge to also live your papel protagonista, your leading role in the context in which your own lives and ministries unfold. That is your contribution. Imagine the possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Hofsman. Nancy Pineda Madrid.
Thank you, Hofsman. I, too, am delighted to be here, and I want to extend my gratitude to Ken and to all Brian, who worked so hard to make this possible. So thank you very much. As you might be able to hear in my voice, I have a little bit of a frog. I'm kind of recovering from a cold here, so I hope that it holds. If it sounds a little scratchy, that's what's going on. I've titled my remarks tonight, On Popular Catholicism, Borderlands Visioning, and the Spiritual Journey. So what I'm really doing tonight is to talk about how Latino Catholicism offers spiritual resources for the Catholic Church here in the United States. To speak about the spiritual resources of the Latino Catholic community is necessarily, for me, a rather personal topic, and not one that I have spoken about often. I want to approach this topic by sharing an example of popular religious practice. But before moving to this, I want to begin by sharing a bit of who I am. Over the course of my life, I have lived in different regions of the United States, but no geographical region of this country has shaped my understanding of the spirituality of Latinos more than the border region of El Paso, Texas, and Juarez, Chihuahua. I am a mujer fronterizada, a woman of the borderlands. Those of you who have traveled to the U.S.-Mexican border know that the plates that appear often on cars from the Mexican side say fronterizada, which means that they are people who live right along the border. So the Mexicans, they understand that. And I'm very much shaped by that world. I grew up in El Paso and there regularly witnessed the clash of wealth and poverty. I frequently saw Border Patrol agents hunting down desperately poor Mexican nationals wading across the Rio Grande in search of a better life for their families. And invariably, after the first cold snap of the fall, the El Paso Times would begin to carry articles about elderly women and men in Juarez living in casas de cartón, houses made of cardboard. They were found dead as a result of the cold weather. My family actively participated in our local parish, and so as a young person, I looked to the church to offer me some way of understanding the suffering that I saw everywhere. Living on the border afforded me a kind of dual vision, a borderlands vision, a way of seeing life and understanding faith. It is a way of seeing that I share with many Latino Catholics. As Latinos, we come from distinct backgrounds, but we share a kind of dual way of seeing. I will return to this idea of a borderlands vision later. It's one of the spiritual resources of Latino Catholicism. While Latino Catholicism offers many spiritual gifts to the Catholic Church, none is more significant than popular religious practices. Let me briefly explain what I mean by popular religious practices. The term popular does not refer to common, widespread, in vogue, or the like. Popular religious practices are popular because those who create them and practice them are faithful Catholics who have been marginalized by the church and marginalized in society. So popular refers to the fact that they are of the people, that they're created by the people. Even a cursory reading of the history of Latinos in the United States reveals a long narrative of exclusion and disregard by Catholic Church officials. For centuries, popular religious practices remained important among Latino believers who wanted to hold on to their Catholic beliefs. And I want to make a connection here that partially works, and that is to the experience here locally in Boston. The Irish here in Boston certainly know this experience of exclusion from their own history. Signs used to be put up in the 1920s through the 1940s here in Boston in business establishments which read NINA, help wanted, no Irish need apply. And similarly, in the Southwest, where I'm from, signs appeared which regularly read, no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans. And this was true up through the 1950s. Well, that legacy has had a huge impact on Latino Catholicism, certainly in the Southwest and more broadly. And while the Irish Catholics here in Boston knew discrimination in society, they did not experience it for the most part within the Catholic Church. Latinos knew this kind of discrimination in the Southwest in society and in the Church. Through popular religious practices, though, Latinos found a way in which to sustain their Catholic faith in the midst of a hostile Church. These practices were the people's way of interpreting their faith. They are not contrary or opposed to church teaching and practices, but they live alongside them. They are a strategy for taking ownership of the faith, for making the Catholic faith one's own. What exactly am I talking about? By popular religious practices, I mean practices like building altars in homes, like the theodramas of Guadalupe, the death of Jesus and the resurrection, which was also has also been done frequently in drama, and the Posadas. I also mean rituals like carrying in your wallet an image of a particular saint or a devotion. And there are many, many other such rituals and practices. When I was 22 years old, I spent a year living in Palomas, Chihuahua, a border town. The two rented rooms I shared with another missionary had a window that looked out on the back of our local Catholic church. On Ash Wednesday, and I remember this very clearly, on Ash Wednesday, in the middle of the day, I looked out my window and saw our local pastor outside burning old vestments, many with beautiful lace on them, making ashes for the evening's services. I went out and I asked him if he would give me the lace and burn the rest. Why, he asked. I said, you know, I just finished college, and when I was there, I worked as a costumer, and I would love to have the lace because I could do a lot with it in terms of costuming. He then said, Nancy, would you direct a play of the Passion of Jesus? I would like it performed for the faithful during Holy Week, both here in Palomas in our neighboring parishes. So for the 40 days of Lent, a couple of times a week, I gathered a group of about 20 would-be actors and actresses, most of them between the ages of 15 and 28. And Don Panchito, who was pushing 65, joined us as well, and he took a role as one of the high priests. And we practiced and practiced and practiced. I saw the transformation of these mostly young people into Pedro, Peter, Santiago, James, Juan, John, Judas, Judas, Maria Magdalena, Maria de Madre de Jesús, Poncio Pilato, and of course Jesus, Jesus, and many others. During Holy Week, we took over the local theater in Palomas and presented our play to a packed house of Catholic faithful. All who attended and were not playing key leading roles in this drama were asked to be the crowd yelling at Pilate, shouting that Jesus had to be crucified. I have taken part in such theodramas in Latino communities in Seattle, in El Paso, and in Oakland as well. How is such a drama, you might be wondering, a spiritual resource? Participation in theodramas encourages each participant to kind of lose themselves in the character they are playing, to experience their own uniqueness and giftedness as existing fundamentally in relationship to God. This dynamic comes about, first of all, because each participant is asked to invest themselves cognitively, emotionally, physically, imaginatively, and even kinesthetically. These dramas are performed on the street, in public, and frequently involve processions. Participants become sensitized to time and space in a fashion different from their ordinary awareness. They become aware of the sacred dimension of time, aware of the drama that is the depth dimension of our lives, the sacred drama of our lives. Accordingly, whatever part a participant plays makes demands on that person, invites them to open themselves to the role and to the insights that it might offer. Our colleague here, Roberto Goizueta, describes this quite well in his account of an experience of a man who played the part of the Roman soldier during a reenactment of the Passion of Jesus. And I would like to read you a quote where he describes this at length. So I quote, The crucifixion of Jesus became present to the Roman soldier nailing Jesus to the cross at San Fernando Cathedral, this is in San Antonio, only because in the physical action of hammering the nails, this poor Mexican man embodied, made concrete and particular, what had earlier been merely an abstract universal concept, a Roman soldier. The Roman soldier was, for this man, no longer an abstraction. The Mexican parishioner was no longer just playing the part of the soldier, he now was the soldier. As the soldier, he was no longer merely pretending to crucify Jesus, he was crucifying Jesus. Thus he could also now proclaim, this was God's Son, no longer as a declaration of an unnamed Roman soldier, but has his own profoundly felt belief. By physically putting himself in the place of the soldier, he recognized his own intrinsic relationship to the soldier, to the multitudes surrounding the cross, to Mary and to Jesus Christ. His own identity was revealed in those relationships, which in turn presupposed the embodiment or incarnation of the faceless, abstract Roman soldier of the biblical text in the concrete, particular historical person of this Mexican man, and thus presupposed the incarnation of the faceless spiritual Christ of faith in that other Mexican man who was now Jesus Christ. Close quote. My point in lifting this quote is to say that theodramas can be a kind of radical schooling in the life of the Spirit. And I think that was clearly true for this man, and that was the point that I thought Roberto was making in this extended quote. In these dramas, participants learn to let go, to enter into the sacred space of the drama, a space in which one can dare to let go of themselves for a while and be a bit more fully present to God who constantly and always comes to meet us. These dramas offer a radical schooling in that they demand one's full attention. They orient, in the words of Simone Weil, and I quote, all the attention of which the soul is capable toward God, close quote. Admittedly, it takes time to build our spiritual muscles and to fully focus our attention in this way. These theodramas are but one way to build spiritual muscles. Theodramas of the Passion of Jesus are not the only theodramas widely performed in Latino communities. In Latin America and in the United States as well, generations of Latinos learned many of the central mysteries of the Christian faith, in part through participation in theodramas. In December, Latino faith communities dramatized Las Posadas, the drama commemorating the immigrant journey of Mary and Joseph in search of shelter just before Jesus' birth. Even though only a few participants play the key roles, the entire community participates in roles of either the various innkeepers from whom Mary and Joseph request lodging, or as the pilgrims who travel with Mary and Joseph in search of lodging. Everyone plays some role and is encouraged to imagine how the person whose role they play might have felt. Here in Boston in mid-December, several organizations gather, and this has been happening for years now. They gather at Boston Commons to reenact Las Posadas, and they link this practice to the current plight of undocumented workers here in the United States. And they call on all of us to extend the gift of hospitality, a need today just as much as it was a need in the time of Jesus. During the same time of year, communities gather to reenact La Pastorela, a shepherd's play which portrays the struggle between good and evil amid the birth of Jesus. This play is put on in parishes during Advent, and everyone present is invited to take on the role of a shepherd, faced with how to receive or not receive the birth of the Christ child. And to mark the beginning of the liturgical year, Latinos often gather to reenact La Virgen de Guadalupe, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and her apparition to Juan Diego. This story marks the birth of Catholic Christianity in the Americas. My own parish in Oakland, California, reenacted this tradition each year at 5 o'clock in the morning on December the 12th. And it was always stunning to the bishop that we would have a packed house at 5 in the morning, but I assure you you we did, of like 500, 600, 700, 800 people. It's a ritual I discovered here in Boston to my great delight at St. Rose of Lima in Chelsea, which reenacts this each year. Although the time I attended it, it wasn't at 5 in the morning, but I was still surprised because this was on a Saturday night at 7 o'clock, and I thought, well, maybe there'll be a couple hundred people. And there was something like 700 or 800 people that showed up on 7 on a Saturday evening, so I thought, wow, there's something here. So those are just a couple of examples of popular religious practices, and there are many, many other examples that I could give, but I will stop there. I want to return to my point about a borderlands vision. Having a borderlands vision or a borderland hermeneutic is another spiritual resource of Latino Catholics. Latinos live in at least two worlds, and many live in more than two. Having grown up in El Paso, I learned to speak English, Spanish, and Spanglish. All are needed in El Paso, Texas. There are radio stations in El Paso where the DJs move between the two languages constantly. Their speech begins to reflect something new, because oftentimes there's a merger that starts to occur. And sometimes you will hear on the streets of El Paso, and those of you who are native Spanish speakers, please don't be offended, but you'll hear phrases like, me voy a lonchar. And those who speak Spanish know that lonchar is certainly not a word in Spanish, but it's a taking of the word lunch in English and expressing it in a kind of Spanish. So it's an example of Spanglish. Words like lonchar represent a kind of borderlands language, a new language. Secondly, by virtue of attending Mass, sometimes in English, sometimes in Spanish, and by virtue of the practices of popular Catholicism and the experience of Euro-American Catholicism as well, Latinos have learned two ways of being Catholic. Latino Catholicism is itself a borderlands experience, often thriving in the cracks of the more widely known and dominant practice of Euro-American Catholicism. Thirdly, Latino cultures and Euro-American cultures are very different ways to be human in this world. So Latinos have developed the ability to move effectively in at least two cultures. If you don't develop this ability, you don't survive here. Fourth, there is a different relationship to land, to geography. Latinos often have a connection to some parcel of land here in the United States, but also know themselves deeply connected to another geographical location, whether it's in Colombia or Cuba or the Dominican Republic or Mexico or El Salvador. A borderlands vision is not unique to Latinos. Many groups in this country know this experience. For example, certainly all ethnic communities in the United States would have some experience of this. African Americans, Korean Americans, folks who are gay or lesbian, folks who are differently abled, all have this kind of a dual vision. They have to in order to survive. What I want to hold up in naming it is that it carries the possibility, and this is not a given, it's only a possibility, the possibility to expand our understanding of what it means to be human, of what it means to live in a big world, of what it means to be different or other. When we, any of us, embrace a borderlands vision, we learn to embrace the radical life that God calls us to. We learn to embrace others who are different from ourselves. In the process, the world, I think, becomes a more humane place and a more God-filled place, a place of creativity, imagination, and transformation. I want to conclude with an example, the final example of popular religious practices. Currently, as you've already heard, I'm working on a book entitled Suffering, Community, and the Possibility of Salvation. Among other things, in this book I explore some of the current expressions of popular religious practices in Juarez, Chihuahua. There is a femicide that has been going on in Juarez, Chihuahua since 1993, and well over 500 women have been brutally murdered in the course of this femicide. A group of women, mostly the mothers of the victims, have begun reinterpreting the Passion by carrying huge pink crosses through the streets of Juarez. They choose the color pink, so they paint these crosses this bright pink to honor their murdered daughters. And they do this in Juarez on it's very interesting, the timing that they choose. They often do this on February the 14th, V-Day, a day that has been selected as a day for the movement to stop violence against women and girls. They do so on March the 8th, which is the International Day of Women. They also do so on November 25th, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And there's a particular connection there because November the 25th, as you may know, was the day that the Mirabel sisters in the Dominican Republic were murdered by Trujillo, brutally murdered. And so that day has been used to work towards the elimination of violence against women. One of the most interesting things about these practices of these women, is that they're linking Christian symbols, primarily the cross, although not exclusively, with the dates associated with women in their experience, which is really pretty. There's something about that's pretty interesting, I think, and very, very important. And I believe that such an endeavor, like what these women are doing, keeps our faith fresh, because they are an example of reading the Christian tradition's age-old symbols in light of very contemporary challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Roberto Goizueta.
I too want to extend my gratitude to Brian for organizing this panel and for organizing this wonderful celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. And I'm truly delighted to be here with people who are my esteemed colleagues and, more importantly, good friends. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all. My task in my remarks is going to be to talk a little bit about the origins of U.S. Latina theology. And to do that, I want to begin with the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II. And Hausman in his remarks referred to the biblical phrase "signs of the times," and among many other reasons, the Second Vatican Council is known, particularly its pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, is known for having called for the Church and for Catholics and for Christians to look to the signs of the times. Drawing on that evangelical message, the bishops said, if we're going to know what it means to be Catholics, what it means to be Christians in the contemporary world, in the world in which we live, we must look not to heaven for signs from heaven, but instead look to the signs of the times, what's going on around us. A few years later, in the Colombian city of Medellin, the Latin American bishops gathered to take up the challenge of Vatican II and to ask themselves, well, what are the signs of the times in Latin America specifically? And they concluded that, of course, the most salient sign of the times was the tremendous poverty, devastating poverty, in which the vast majority of their people lived. And they judged that poverty and that injustice to be contrary to the will of God. And they committed themselves to become a church of the poor. And they explicitly said, not a church for the poor, not a church with the poor, but a church of the poor, to become a poor church. In doing so, the Latin American bishops at Medellin set forth the kind of parameters, the framework of what would come to be known as the preferential option for the poor. This notion, the preferential option for the poor, has become an intrinsic part of Catholic social teaching and has been later affirmed, especially by Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI, both as the latter, both as Pope and as Cardinal Ratzinger as head of the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. So the preferential option for the poor is now an integral part of Catholic social teaching. It then became most systematically articulated in the works of Latin American liberation theologians. And liberation theology being a movement in Latin America that strives to read the Bible through the eyes of the poor. And that's basically all I would say liberation theology is the attempt to read the Bible through the eyes of the poor. And to understand God from the perspective of the poor. The assumption being that what you see in the Bible is influenced by where you stand, where you're standing, or where you're sitting when you're reading it. And if in fact we believe that Jesus Christ, that the Christian God is identified in a special way with the hungry, as we read in Matthew 25, with the naked, with the imprisoned, with the ill, then to be a Christian theologian and to claim to speak about that Christ and to claim to speak about that God is to place ourselves there alongside the hungry, the naked, the imprisoned, the ill. And if we fail to do so, then we cannot claim to be speaking about the God of Jesus Christ. If God is transcendent, if God cannot be fully comprehended within any strictly human worldview, if God transcends the boundaries of our world, then God will be found in a special way, not only, but in a special way among those persons who themselves are not comprehended or comprehensible by our regnant worldviews. Those persons who themselves make no sense in our world of power-seeking and consumption, namely the powerless. If God is mystery, with a capital M, God will be found in a special way among the hungry person who is a mystery to a satiated society, the naked person who is a mystery to a well-clothed society, the powerless person who is a mystery to a power-hungry society, the failure who is a mystery to a society obsessed with success. That identification is what prevents us from turning God into an idol, from ever thinking that we've got God figured out. This preferential option for the poor safeguards, then, God's mystery against the normal human assumption that God is identified with power, with victory, with security, and success. Now, this doesn't mean that the poor are any better than the rich or the wealthy. It simply means that the poor, and I can refer here to Nancy's reference to the borderland, those who live on the borders, shall we say, are in a place that is privileged in terms of their ability to recognize God's activity in the world today, because God has revealed to us that, in fact, God is present in a special way on the margins, on the border, among those who are powerless in our world. So that's kind of the background for my following comments about the emergence of U.S. Latina theology. Many of us who were studying theology in the 70s and early 80s were very much influenced by the way of doing theology that I've just described. In the early 80s, a number of us who now call ourselves Latino theologians, at the time, of course, we didn't yet, the term didn't really exist. We had been studying theology in graduate school. We were fresh out of graduate school with newly minted PhDs in theology, and we came together and to ask ourselves, what would it look like to take that methodology, that preferential option for the poor, and try to articulate and develop a theology out of a preferential option for the U.S. Hispanic communities in the United States. That is, rather than simply import Latin American theology into the United States, which would actually contradict the very methodology we were talking about, that is, importing a foreign, in a certain sense, theology into a community which, while having Latin American roots, is nevertheless in the United States. What would it look like to begin to articulate a theological reflection out of the U.S. Latino context? And it was out of those discussions that we, 8 of us at the time, decided that we really needed to commit ourselves to try to do just that, to try to accompany our people, our communities, and to try to, out of that process of accompaniment, to try to bring to the surface and to articulate in theological categories what was the wisdom that was present in the religious practices of Latinos in the United States. That is, what might theology look like if we began to realize that the text that we theologians needed to reflect upon was not simply words on a page, but were the actual lives, the actual lived faith of the poor in our communities. That is, if Christ is present in the signs of the times, if Christ is present in a very concrete way in the everyday lives, especially of the poor, then we are called to reflect precisely on those lives and on the theological significance of those lives. Another way of putting this was that we wanted to make clear that what Hoffman refers to as the Hispanic presence, and what the bishops in their pastoral letter, the U.S. bishops, referred to as the Hispanic presence, was not simply a pastoral. There is theological wisdom, theological insights. Very concretely, if we don't pay attention to the way in which Christ's presence is available to us through such lives of faith. And then it became clear to us that the U.S. Latino context had its own particularity that was different from Latin American. For example, the idea of the borderland. What would happen if we begin to look at the border as a place from which we do theology? And what does that experience fronteriza, what does the experience of the border contribute to Christian theology? Well, a number of Latino theologians began to do just that. The one who has done it most explicitly, Virgil Elizondo, Father Virgil Elizondo, who wrote a book called The Galilean Jesus, began to read the scriptures out of his own context in San Antonio, Texas, as a priest, and having been born and grown up in San Antonio, began to realize, well, Jesus, who grew up and ministered in Galilee, was also a person of the borderland. Galilee was a region of Palestine distant from Jerusalem. and as a result, he was looked down upon by those in the center of power in Jerusalem. He wasn't trusted. People who are far away from the centers of power are beyond the control of those who are in the centers of power. So that when we read then the scriptures from this context of a borderland context, we begin to recognize and see things that others have failed to see. And this has happened not just among Latinos, but among all sorts of communities. Women especially have begun to read the scriptures and to recognize the ways in which, for example, Jesus reaches out to women and identifies with women in a way that was very countercultural at the time. So that when we read the scriptures through the eyes of the poor, through the eyes of the marginalized, we begin to see new insights. Central to this, to Latino theology, has been precisely what Nancy called popular religious practices. That is, that for a people who are marginalized and who are a minority, and that's another distinction, obviously, social distinction at least, between Latin Americans in Latin America and Latin Americans in the United States. The minority status makes culture and language, gives it a special salience, a special importance in terms of identity that it wouldn't necessarily have in Latin America. Well, popular Catholicism, popular religious practice has become a way not only of relating to God and relating to each other, but a way of affirming and asserting one's traditions and therefore one's culture and one's identity. As a Latino theologian, I see my challenge and task then is of bringing that wisdom, those theological insights, the theological insights not just of great intellectuals, but the theological insights of my grandmother, the theological insights of the women that Nancy talked about, bringing those theological insights to bear on the theological enterprise, what we're doing in universities and seminaries, and to say, hey, you know, that there are people and voices and experiences in the world that are not being taken into account in the way in which we do theology. Conversely, I see my task also of bringing the theology, the great Catholic theological tradition, into engagement with people in their everyday lives. Finally, just a couple of comments about the future of U.S. Hispanic or Latino theology. There are currently new generations, exciting new generations of scholars with new questions and new issues. I mentioned that the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians began with 8 of us over 20 years ago. Now it's, I think, almost 200 members of the organization. So this is a tremendous challenge to remain open to the kinds of questions and issues that are raised by new generations. But it's a challenge also to all of you out there, to the BC students, to take up this challenge and to make your voices heard, and to challenge us, the old fogies, the old folks, to develop further our theologies. I always think of theology or any intellectual task for that matter as an ongoing conversation. That is, I put my 2 cents out there, and it's the other generations, the people who come after me, their responsibility to engage that and to put their 2 cents in. And so it's a movement. It's not a set. It's not written in stone. It's an ongoing movement, and the new generations give new energy to that movement. I think the real challenge confronting Latino theologians in the future, as all Latinos, is what Hoffman mentioned. What does it mean to become now a majority in the Catholic Church? we're so accustomed to being minority, how do we accept the responsibility of setting the agenda, not simply criticizing the agendas that other people set, but what we have to decide what is our agenda, what are our agendas. What does it mean to go from to become a majority of U.S. Catholics? It's kind of ironic that we talk about the Hispanic presence. In a few years, we may be asking or talking about the challenge of the Irish presence in the Catholic Church. It's not a Hispanic presence; it's already virtually a predominantly Hispanic church, and certainly under the age of 30, it's already a majority Hispanic church. So I invite anybody and all of you out there who would like to take up a challenge to join us here and to help us to begin to forge the path of the future of the Catholic Church in the United States. As Haussmann says, it's not a choice that we have. It's really an imperative and a necessity, because the future of the Catholic Church in the United States is dependent upon how we respond to this challenge. Thank you.